Welcome to Heart Speak Podcast, episode 285, The Healing Power of Focused Imagination. Well, hello there, wherever you are in the world. It's good to be back with you. Thank you for joining me. And I hope you enjoyed bringing light to your heart or expressing that light out of your heart into the world, bringing about transformation of creativity, new ideas, new ways of being. The power of the heart to do that. And we're continuing this theme, as I suggested last time, because I want to bring to mind this relationship between Saturn and Neptune, which are both in Pisces. And as they're coming closer together, they will actually not totally reach each other in Pisces, but they'll be very close March next year, and then towards the end of next year. But they are going to be meeting in Aries, which is a very different story. Saturn and Neptune being in Aries, which is about new beginnings. And I know I'll be talking about that at another time. But let's just concentrate on Saturn being in Pisces, Neptune being in Pisces, Neptune being unlimited, Saturn being limited. So what I wanted to share with you is that's why I'm using this word focused imagination. Neptune is that unlimited imagination. Saturn is, let's focus ourselves. And in some ways, the way in which we've often looked at it is life fated, or do we have choices? And what I want to describe is we have both. There is a blueprint, a pattern in which we're following that has multiple levels to it, from our own soul's journey, our own higher self, our oversoul, our divine self, etc. So there are patterns or matrices within matrices. But there's also a freedom that you can also work within. Before I go there, let's just look at what is healing. So healing, as you may have heard me say, is about becoming whole. The word wholeness, holus, healing, they all mean the same thing. So my first book, Frontiers of Health, the subtitle was Healing into Wholeness. And as I've described it, I see us as a beautiful multi-petaled flower with our soul in the center, our heart in the center. And all those petals represent my personas. And my purpose this life is to express my soul's essence, my soul's light through those personas into a three-dimensional, four-dimensional world, create an experience, embody that experience, and then bring the light of that experience. What did I learn through that? How did I grow through that? Back into my heart to bring enlightenment to my soul, light up my light body, so that eventually when my whole flower is lit up, all my petals are open, I've expressed myself through all those petals and lit them up, I will once again exist in my light body, which is my fifth dimensional body, and I will no longer be having physical experiences. I will no longer need to have a physical experience to be able to be extended and expanded into other dimensions. But as I am, I'm having a physical experience, which we express as a 3 or 4 dimensional body experience. And anybody who is having an experience through a humanoid existence like me, which might be from Sirius or from the Pleiades, also is understanding that it is this amazing physical body that we have, which is 99% plasma. It's not just a physical molecular form, but it is through this amazing body that we also experience transformation, enlightenment, as we do through the earth, which of course we come from that earth through its elements. So our physical earth, our physical body is essential for our transformation and our enlightenment. Now, why do I bring all of this up? Is that I met with someone last week who was telling me that her spiritual teacher had told her that all you need to do to have that fifth dimensional experience, to be ascended, is to allow the light to come in at the top of your head through the crown chakra, to let that light come in, and bingo, you're there, you're a fifth dimensional being. I felt it was a little simplistic, especially since the reason that the person was contacting me was that she had had a 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional experience, an emotionally charged physical experience. And she much preferred to believe that she could just escape that experience and the consequences of it by bringing that light in and ascending into her higher self. And I think we might call that disassociating or in being in denial. And she really made out to me that this is how it is. You don't ever have to experience anything that's difficult because you always just can ascend to these other levels. Of course, the challenge for me was that you actually chose to be here on this planet in this physical form in order to have this experience, to have that enlightenment. And the best way of doing that is to take some accountability for our actions. That wasn't necessarily the answer she wanted, but it made me really understand that this ability to be accountable, to take responsibility, is not a heavy weight. It's giving us power to make choices to do maybe next time something different. And unless we experience that, we will never, if I may say, grow or become enlightened. And enlightenment to me is not about cutting yourself off from difficult experiences. In fact, what we understand from this energy that we're embodying, we are becoming more sensitive to our environment. And many of you are feeling that. But the more that we become enlightened, the lighter our body, the less, if I may say, veils and masks there are, the more sensitive we are to the effects of our actions on other people. In other words, we're more connected to people, not necessarily just in an empathic way when you feel everybody else's energy, but now you're realizing that what you do does have an impact. And it doesn't just have an impact on your people around you, it might have an impact on the environment, on your spiritual guidance, etc. So actually we become more aware of collaboration, cooperation, communication, how we are not disconnected, we are more and more connected. And therefore, what we do with our energy is more and more important. Again, this idea of a kind of focused imagination, it means, yes, imagination's out there, but the more enlightened we become, the more we become focused on what we want to do. And this brings me back between the fate and the free will. The way I like to say it is that when we are relatively asleep, unconscious, disconnected, I like to see it as if we're walking a tightrope, but the tightrope is literally on the ground. So it's almost saying there's not much risk, and we can move off that tightrope and make choices and do other things and come back on again at some point. So even though we have a fatedness, we have a lot of free will. It's a kind of strange thing to say, but we can move off and we can come back on again. But the fact of the matter is that when we're on that very almost asleep state, what we think is a lot of movement or a lot of free will is very limited. So our imagination is very limited. So we think, oh, look, I'm making all these choices, which, I don't know, which coffee shall I have or which ice cream? But it's almost like we're not seeing the vast amount of ice creams that are available in the universe. So the more asleep we are, the less choice, but we believe we have choice. And we believe that we have greater places to roam. As we open up more of our petals, the tightrope goes higher and higher. And what we become is more aware of the connections around us. Now, wow, the world is opening up. There's more sky, we can see more sky. But as we become more aware, we also become more aware of the path that we're on and how rich it feels when we make those connections to the deep, deep, higher self, oversoul, divine self. In other words, we become more aware of our deeper connections, and they feel so loving and connected that even though our imagination is now bigger, our choices are limited only by us because we don't want to move as far. Hope that makes sense. And so it feels as if the tightrope gets higher, we get a vast amount of opportunities, but because it's so much higher, we can't move so far off that tightrope without falling into problems. There's no net now. So the more enlightened you are, the more you see, the more you experience, but the less you want to stray away from what feels good for you. And that is where I think the Saturn comes in. It's not that Saturn's trying to restrict you, it's giving you a deeper connection to, wow, this is what really matters. This is my focus. So what you might say, what I might have done in my teenage years, I don't want to do in my 30s or my 40s or my 50s. So you had a lot of freedom and you had a lot, but now you're really seeing what the possibilities are. But you feel, because you're seeing that amount of freedom and the opportunities, you want to make sure you make the most of them. Hope that makes sense. And so the more we open our hearts, the more we let that light into our hearts, the more we see of what's around us, the more we live with what we call integrity. And integrity is wholeness. It's to become integral, is to become whole. And the more intuitive we become, and the more focused we become on where we want to go to find wholeness. And it's a little bit like seeing so much, but now being much more tuned into what works for you and what doesn't. So the more you open up, the more you'll say, yes, I can do anything, but this is what really resonates with me. And you're not distracted by things that don't resonate with you. And it's, again, not because someone's telling you to do this, it's because it feels so rich. The more you're connecting, the more your heart is connecting to these really deep levels, the more it's like your heart is singing and it's like, I want more of this. This feels so good. I hope that's making sense. So healing into wholeness is really about listening to your heart, listening to your intuition, being able to focus on what really brings harmony to you, and making wise choices. And those choices, it's never quite easy to say there's a right and a wrong choice. Sometimes we make a choice that feels strange. There's a small part of us going, don't do it. But we make that choice because it's the right thing to do, even though we don't know why we're making that choice. I always like to just refer to my first marriage. On some level, I knew that this was going to be a disastrous marriage, if I want to say that word, but actually it was the best thing that ever happened to me. And I don't even want to say it was disastrous. I knew there was going to be some part of me was going to die in that marriage. But because of that dying, I grew. I became more of myself. What died was my innocence, my sense of naivety. So maybe you've been through experiences where you've said, yeah, this feels really strange, but I've got to do it. And only afterwards do you understand why. And this is the path that we're taking between Saturn and Neptune. More opportunities, more focused on what you want to do with those opportunities. This is bringing the two together. And it's going to culminate in both these planets getting towards, or obviously going to 29 degrees and then moving into Aries. So it's almost like the opportunities are getting wider and wider. And I think what's important is when it's Pisces, it's also saying, where am I following a delusion? Where am I getting lost in someone else's story? Where have I lost touch with my reality? So that's why the Saturn in Pisces was always like checking in. Who are you following? does where they're going actually lead you to a deepening of your knowledge of yourself, a deepening healing, or is it taking you off on some fantasy world? Does it just praise you and make you feel better? Because if it creates more polarization, oh, I'm better than those people, I'm more enlightened, I'm this and that, then you're probably going in the wrong direction. Or if it's become addictive, they're the two qualities one wants to watch out for in Pisces is, am I becoming addictive to these ideas or who the person I'm following, or does it feel like I'm following a fad, or I just want to be one of the followers? Or does it feel restrictive? You know, you've got to follow this path and you'll never get there, so don't even worry, but I'm the one that can lead you there. These are the things you have to watch out for. Where does it feel restrictive? Where does it feel that I'm following a fad or addicted to something? Or where does it feel delusional, that it feels wonderful, but it's just feeding my ego? If none of that's happening, then follow your heart. Follow the structure of your heart. Follow what feels right. And when I take this to the next level or another level, I just wanted to bring in some of the teachings I've been listening to from a man called Glen Rein, doctor who I greatly admire and who I met, it must be over 30 years ago, and I can almost see the living room in England somewhere, as we often got to talk and hear wonderful speakers in living rooms in England. And Glen Rein is a biochemist. He's worked a lot with looking at DNA within a petri dish in water and the effects of healing or energy on that DNA. And one of his particular experiments was, could a healer cause that DNA to unwind or wind? That was his mechanism of looking to see if something was changing. He also looked at, could a healer change the energy or the frequency of that DNA? And this has been work he's been doing for decades. And he's been revealed in a few movies that I've watched, where his work is very interesting to see what healing powers or energies can do to DNA. And I think what this really says to us is, it's not just our minds that are having an effect on us. It's our DNA is, you could say, the action of our body. What action is taking place? And our DNA is not just listening, but it's also sending information out. And I think this is what I've learned, that a DNA is not just double strands, as we often see this sort of linear double strand helix. It's actually a toroid. Here we go back to my toroid again. And this toroid, as Glen Rein talks about, it's a never-ending eternal energy that some could describe like a donut, if you're a ring donut, but it also has this energy that's both being received and sent out at the same time. So I think if I could just even get the idea that DNA is this wonderful antennae, both sending and receiving energy, but it's also, because it's a toroid, able to transmute energy. So it takes light energy in, or again, I'll call it divine light energy or quantum light energy, and it transforms it into electromagnetic energy that then has an effect to change the biochemistry of the body. So DNA has that wonderful mechanism. And what he found is that one of the things that DNA is able to do, it's able to bring about self-repair, self-assembly, self-organization of the cell. And I think we sometimes forget that our body has this amazing power to transform itself. So we don't see that, don't we? But if you cut yourself or you have an abscess or something, it's amazing how the body can say, okay, let's go to work. And we call it our immune response. But all these amazing parts of our cells go to work to bring about the transformation, the reassembling. And in many ways, what the body's doing, or this mechanism it's doing, is saying, okay, what was the original plan? Oh, okay, this is what we want this to look like. And so many weeks after you've got you cut your finger, you can't even see where it was. So the body said, okay, we did a good job to repair this. This is great. So this wonderful ability that the body has to repair itself is amazing, depending on what we've done. But there is times where it's not about physical repair, because the body is saying, okay, that's all fine. And again, as I said, this isn't necessarily healing to me. Sometimes the body says, okay, we're moving towards wholeness, So repairing the physical body isn't the answer. We have to move our wholeness or change things at a higher level. So as Bruce Lipton would say, we have to change our minds. So here we are. It's okay. It's the physical body is suffering, but the problem is not at the physical level. It's at the level of the lower mind, or the lower astral mind, as some people call it, which is fixated on a particular belief. And it's only by becoming physically ill or going through some crisis that we actually change our minds. And that's never easy, but sometimes it's through the body that the mind says, okay, we have to change. Some crisis hits us, isn't it? That we eventually listen, that we change our mind. So changing our mind is still on the DNA level, because the DNA is not just existing on the physical level, it's actually listing on those 12 different frequencies. And again, we go from just a 2-strand DNA of physicality to 12 different levels of frequency that we now know at least that the DNA is responding to, in this sense of antennae, listening and sending and receiving. So the DNA is this multi-frequency portal into changing energy, moving energy, listening to consciousness on many levels. And one of its ways of doing this is to be able to communicate with our emotional body, our physical body, our mental body, and say, okay, something needs to change. That's what I'm trying to just put across. Then at the next level up, we might say our higher self says, okay, if I'm going to really get through to you, I've got to bypass this lower mind. I've got to make sure that we don't take all the baggage from the lower mind that seems to just keep creating a problem. And we have to send a higher level in. So sometimes our higher mind comes through, many times our higher mind comes through, and we get an intuitive hit that we've got to do something that bypasses the lower mind that's kind of going, what do you mean we're going to do this? And then we might get a message from the oversoul, etc., etc. So when we're talking about healing, again, we're not just talking about physical healing. We're saying that our being is saying what needs to happen to bring about the greatest sense of wholeness for this individual. And that might mean physical illness. It might even mean death. So many times we don't always understand why we're going through something, but on another level, it's almost like saying it's only when we disable this individual, we switch something off or we switch something on, that we're able to bring that person to a higher level of wholeness. So this whole question of healing is very complex, as you might know. And what Glen Rein, looked at was, he said, this isn't always clear to the healers he'd met. He said, some healers just have a focus on, this is what I want to happen, and I'm going to make it happen. And there's nothing wrong with that. But he said, healing into wholeness is much more complex than just trying to get rid of symptoms. And what he found was that different healers had a different effect on the DNA that he had in his laboratory. The ones that focused on bringing in higher light, so bringing in light or working with the higher being, the higher self, really from a higher self, and opening themselves up to saying, I am just bringing that light in, that had a different effect from someone who was perhaps more focused on bringing about a specific result, but from their lower mind. Now, I've worked with healers all my life, and I know that many healers would tell me, well, I'm, just a vessel for light. That's what I'm doing, is just bringing in divine light, saying what is best for this client, let that be. But I've always felt that it's like running water through a rusty pipe. We can no longer just say I'm a vessel for pure light without doing our own work. And if we put clear water through a rusty pipe, we're going to get rusty water. I don't care what you say. So to me, it is inherent in us to do our own work, to clear our pipe, to be aware of what we carry, Because however you or this lady might say, I'm just divine light coming in, unless we really understand ourselves and work with our own baggage, our own stories, what we end up giving to our client is some of that baggage and some of that rusty water. And Glen Rein, again, I haven't got necessarily a solution for this because it's so complex. He said that many a time he sees that the body has different needs. We all know that. So he said, for instance, if you have an inflammation, you want to calm down the immune system or at least help to bring healing to that area. Again, it depends. But let's say it's just inflamed, it's red. You want to pour some cool water on it. Other times, however, you want to speed something up, get something moving. You could say a hypothyroid, a thyroid that's not particularly active. You want to speed it up. He said too often the healer doesn't always resonate with the frequency and which direction you need to be moving. And I think that's true. For instance, I've been to sound healers who say, oh, I love playing these sounds. They're going to be good for you. And I'm maybe having to say, please stop them because they're not good for me. You're not in resonance with me. You're doing what you plan to do. And I think that's often a problem with many structured forms of healing where you go through a routine, but it's not necessarily in line with the person. So how do we as healers, and I'm not suggesting all of you are working specifically as healers, but really being out in the world, how do we find the right rhythm or resonance with what it is that we're trying to help? And getting out of our own way. So one way is to make sure we, as I say, do our own inner work, clear our own baggage, be aware of what we carry. Where were we rusty that needs to be cleared? Where are we caught up in wanting praise? In other words, I'm doing this for you and I hope you're appreciative. Where do we have an attachment to a result? That's going to get in the way of our healing. And thirdly, where are we working from the head through some structure? I've got to do it this way, and not through the heart. Because it's only when we're in that heart energy can we feel the rhythm and the resonance with the people around us, our environment, etc. And it's not about us. And this is the challenge, I think, because when I call it focused imagination, imagination means there's lots of possibilities. But to be focused, it's almost as if we have to both release any expectations and yet have a focus of the direction we want to move in. And this to me is a real importance of intuition. What needs to happen here? So I would say as an intuitive myself is where do I need to calm something down? But I can only receive that information by getting out of my own way and actually listening and feeling into my client. You might be a gardener. Maybe the question is, what does this plant need? Too often we say, oh, well, the plant needs this because this is what I've read or I know from previous times. But being able to empty our minds, get into our heart and listen to the plant, sometimes the plant says, I need to die. Or I need to be out of this pot or whatever it is, or this is not the place for me. So our ability to have focused imagination means getting out of our minds into our hearts and listening to the frequency that is required to bring change in the world. And that frequency, as I say, in simple terms, may bring quietening, even death to something, or it might bring life and enlightenment, but we have to be able to listen to this. And that's what I mean by focused imagination. The possibilities are there, opening ourselves up to our innocence, our inner sense, and yet listening. Frequency plus intention equals healing. Frequency of what intention, what energy am I bringing? Just one final way of saying it is I can say the same words, but I can use it in a very strict way, or I can use it in a gentle way. That is my frequency. How do I deliver my message And that message, that frequency of my message, plus the imagination, in other words, to bring visual imagery or to actually see it happening, brings the healing. Now, imagination or visual imagery might not be your forte. You might not be so good at that, but you may say, I feel it happening. I sense it's happening. In other words, be the change you want to bring to the world. Bring that imagination, that happening, that visualization, that what you're wanting to happen, feel it now, see it now, and be very focused on how you wish that to be effective in the world. In other words, what do you see happening? And once you bring that focused imagination in with a clear mind, a clear and open heart, magic happens. I hope this has been useful to you. I feel this whole field is really expanding. I think the whole idea of healing is really expanding beyond anything we've imagined. But as I heard and will say once again, do not give your power away to other people, devices, because where you need to go is already in your heart. Doesn't mean that instruments, devices, healers can't help, but you're the one that's directing the way in which you know to become whole. Ask for them to help and support you in that more than anything else, and all will be good. Until next time, bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the HeartSpeak podcast with Dr. Christine Page. Please check out all HeartSpeak episodes in the podcast archive section on www.christinepage.com. HeartSpeak is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Tumblr, and now playing on Amazon Music and iHeart Radio. You can also watch the archive podcast on Christine's channel, on YouTube, and now on Rumble. Connect with Christine on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook group, The Great Mother Calling. Do share with family, friends, colleagues. Join us next time for another edition of HeartSpeak.